It's spring and it's time to start cleaning up the garden. What I'd like to do in this video is have a look at some special cases, some plants that I treat different than the rest of the garden. But before I get into that, let me quickly tell you how I do spring cleanup. So here's an old hosta and the flower stems are up here. I can't believe they're almost 6 feet tall. So we got to get rid of the vertical stuff in the garden, and I like to use hedge trimmers. And I just come along and give them a quick cut. That's all there is to it. I leave all those stems right here because they'll decompose and they'll feed the plants right here. The leaves from the hosta are already on the ground and I just leave those. So for 99% of my plants, I cut the top part down. Anything laying on the ground, I leave alone. But there are some special cases, and that's what we're going to have a look at in this video. If you want to learn more about spring cleanup, I've made a special video of that, and I'll put a link to it at the end of this one. These are my winter aconites, and they've been growing here for a number of years, and they've seeded around quite a bit, and I've got lots of babies here. In fact, last year I pulled most of these out and moved them to other parts of the garden, but there's enough babies coming back that I'll have to do that again. Winter aconites come out early, and they're very low plants. I mean, I have about an inch here, that's it. Wherever you have this kind of plant, very early and very short, it's a good idea to come along really early and take all the leaves off. And I did that about 4 weeks ago because I know this is a spot where they grow. In general, I leave the leaves in the garden. But for these short plants, you really have to take them off. If you have too many leaves on here, it'll smother the flowers and they just won't come up properly. These poor things simply can't grow 5-6 inches tall to get above the leaves. So very early, clean this area up a bit. Take those leaves and just throw them over there. You don't have to take them away. Here's another exception to my spring cleanup. This is a lavender bush. Now, a lot of people think that this is a perennial, and I'm not surprised because it's included in most perennial books, and if you go to the nursery to buy it, it's in the perennial section. But this is not a perennial. This is actually a shrub, and we call these subshrubs, which just means that they're very short shrubs. But they grow more like a tree or a shrub. If you take this and cut it to the ground, you might kill it. Because the lower stems are woody, if you cut them too low, there are no dormant buds to grow and you've killed it. So the best thing to do with lavender is just leave it for now. Wait until late spring when you see the new growth. That will tell you how far down you can cut it. And then simply cut it so that there's at least some new growth on every stem. If you do that, you'll have no trouble growing lavender. Now there are some other subshrubs in the garden. Russian sage is another subshrub. And again, you treat it like the lavender. Don't cut it back until late spring when it starts to grow. Another exception in my spring cleanup is the hellebore. Now this is a bed I created a couple years ago and it's full of seedlings. Many of them bloomed last year for the first time, and I've marked the ones I want to keep and I'll get rid of the others. But in spring it's important that you cut these back a little more carefully than most perennials. If you don't do that, you'll cut off the flower spikes. What you see when you look at these plants in early spring depends very much on your climate. Now I'm in zone 5, and you'll see that many of these leaves are quite brown. Okay, we call this evergreen, but in zone 5 they're barely evergreen. If I reach under here, this leaf is still pretty green, but it was probably covered by this one, and so it was protected from the cold. So it really depends on the kind of winter we have. If we have a cold winter, I get more brown leaves. If we have a mild winter, I have more green leaves. In areas that have a lot of snow cover, they're also greener. Now, if we look at how this plant grows, these are all last year's leaves, and they're not going to continue growing. So even the green ones are pretty much finished. It's going to start growing from the center, make flowers and new leaves. You have two options. You can leave these leaves. The plant really doesn't care. After all, in nature, nobody comes to clean it up. But from an aesthetic point of view, it's usually better to clean these up. The problem we have is that if you come and just cut everything to the ground, you're probably going to damage the flower buds. So you need to do it a little more carefully. What I like to do is clean up the plant a little bit. get rid of some of these leaves, just so I can see what I'm doing. And as soon as I do that, I can see the new buds coming here. So this is where all the flowers are going to be. And as we cut this back, we have to be careful not to damage these. So get your secateurs and gently cut the leaves back. Here's another plant that you have to be very careful with spring cleaning. This is an epimedium. They're almost evergreen in zone 5. And I find that the lower leaves here are quite green, but the ones that are near the top, they got too cold and they're brown. And so those won't regrow. But this is one of these plants that flowers very early in the season. And if you wait too long to clean it up, you're going to cut off those flowers. So you can do a couple things. Sometimes I just come in and kind of rake the leaves with my hand. And I just pull off the dead stuff. You can also come in with secateurs and cut the top off. You want to leave a couple inches of stem. You don't want to cut close to the crown or you may damage the flowers. Over here the leaves are green and I could leave those, but then you won't see the flowers as well. Now, none of this cleanup is required for the plant, but if you do this, you get a much nicer floral display. So it is worthwhile doing. As it's flowering, it starts making the new leaves, very similar to the hellebores. And in no time at all, you'll have a nice clump of leaves again. This is a great plant for part shade and even deep shade locations, although it actually prefers a fair amount of sun and lots of water. But because it grows so well in deep shade, a lot of people recommend it for deep shade. It's a great ground cover. So I've shown you a few exceptions to the standard spring cleanup, and there are others. What's important for you to do is to go into the garden and observe the plants. See how they're growing. The plants themselves will tell you how you should clean them up in spring. If you have any doubts at all, just leave them. Mother Nature doesn't clean them up. So if you leave them alone and do nothing, you won't harm the plant. Once you know how it's growing, you can make better decisions for spring cleanup. I have a whole video on regular spring cleanup, and I'll put a link to it right here.